Hi, this is the Wine and Life podcast. I want to say, first off, I'm Pastor Wes, and I am sorry that it has been so long. I started school. I was doing a semester school online. I thought I'd be able to continue doing the videos. I could not, so I had to do school. I finished with that semester, so now I'm back here. So we're gonna go into today the book of Ruth, and we're just going to talk about what the book of Ruth is supposed to represent for the church, for Israel, and what it was supposed to be. Now, it's a 4-chapter book. It's very small, so people call it a little novella. And what it represents ultimately for them is supposed to show God's providence of bringing David to the throne. So if you read the end of it, Ruth 4:13 through 22, you'll see that there are genealogies given, and how David comes from Ruth, but also how David comes from Pharez, which is a son of Judah. So the king of Judah, and David is supposed to be this representative, essentially, for all of Israel. Just as Israel was redeemed and taken from Egypt and brought into the land, Ruth, being outside of the land, was brought back in, redeemed, and then brings forth this child. So if you read something like Ezekiel 16, 1 through 14, or 2 Samuel 12, 7 and 8, there are parallels there with how the nation of Israel is viewed and the way that David was brought up. So he talks about in 2 Samuel 12 how I brought you up out of nowhere. You were a shepherd. You were nothing. I brought you up and brought you to the throne. And the same, Ezekiel 16, he talks about how Israel was a child in its own blood, and that he found on the highway, and he cleaned up, and so on and so forth, and brought them to be a pleasant land. Now, so we look at the two main characters. I'm not going to go over Orpah much, or Elimelech, but Naomi. And what Naomi is really supposed to be is this picture of Israel exiled, right? So just as we find Abraham, Isaac, Jacob get exiled due to famine, Naomi gets sent out due to this famine, and her name means the pleasant land, which is the same name that you have for Israel. So when we look at something like Zechariah 7:14 or some other places, Israel is explicitly called the pleasant land. So that is the word Naomi. That's her name. But when you read something like Psalm 107, why were they sent away? In Psalm 107:33, it says, He turns rivers into a desert, springs of water into thirsty ground, a fruitful land into a salty waste because of the evil of the inhabitants. And so when we look at what happened there, Israel went through a famine, and therefore Naomi and her family had to leave, and it was because of that. And so due to sin, they were cast away from the presence of the Lord. And so there's this picture of Eve and Adam being cast away from the garden. If you read Isaiah 51, 1 through 3, you'll see that Mount Zion, Jerusalem, is seen as the garden of God for the people of Israel. I'm going to read you that for you real fast, because I like seeing these parallels. But he also brings up Abraham in this discussion. So he says this, Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness, you who seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were hewn, to the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abraham your father and Sarah, who bore you, for he was but one when I called him, that I might bless him and multiply him. For the Lord comforts Zion, he comforts all her waste places, and makes her wilderness like Eden, her desert like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness will be found in her, thanksgiving and the voice of song. And so Israel, Jerusalem, Judah, is seen as this place of the garden of God. And these are people of the tribe of Judah, and yet they're being cast out due to famine. And so this is very similar to what the Lord talks about in the prophets when he says, I'm going to make give you a famine, but it will not be a famine of resources. It will be a famine of my word, and you'll be cast away. I think that's in Hosea, maybe Micah. So Naomi is this picture of both Eve and Israel, right? And we see this as a continuing story with all of Israel, them being cast away. And of course, just like Adam and Eve, and later, of course, Cain, they go east of Eden. She goes to Moab, which is east of Eden, into what's called Moab being the firstborn. If you read from Genesis 19:30 through 37, Lot was running away from Sodom and Gomorrah. It was destroyed. His wife was killed. The daughters thought it was the end of time, essentially. The firstborn daughter decided to get Lot drunk, and due to the incestuous relationship, they had a child they named Moab, and Moab sounds like or is supposed to mean firstborn. So she goes into this foreign land, and she meets, her sons meet these two women, Orpah and Ruth. And so, which one was, Mahlon was Ruth's husband, but they both die. And again, we see the spouse dying, and we see this recurring in Genesis as well, where Sarah dies. We see Rebekah dying before Isaac. We see Rachel dying before Jacob. So this is a recurring theme again of famine, exile, death of a spouse. And so now what Ruth is supposed to be is this picture of the Gentiles being made fellow heirs. Now, Moabites were supposed to be cast away from Israel because of their aiding with what's his name? The prophet Balaam of Beor. He cursed Israel. And so in Deuteronomy 23, 1 through 6, God says, unto the 10th generation, don't let the Moabites come into the assembly of the congregation of the Lord. So she is this Moabite, but she says, my God will be your God. And from that part in Ruth, that's where we get the idea of till death do us part. So it's sort of like a marriage claim. I'm going to be married to you. And Paul talks about this later, the Gentiles being made fellow heirs in Ephesians 3:6. And so she is this picture of the new Eve, the church, being married to the kinsman redeemer. And the seed that's brought forth, right, the seed from the kinsman redeemer brings forth the one who rules over everything. So David then is their seed, and he, as king, is the one who reunites both Israel and Gentile together. And so what happens during this period of time is that Naomi had changed her name to Mara, which means bitter, which is a picture of how Israel, when they were out in the wilderness, they called the place Mara because they couldn't drink the water before the tree was thrown in. And so Israel today, spiritually, is out in the wilderness. They're cast away. But Ruth, being married to the kinsman redeemer, that the son of David eventually is going to be the one who is going to reunite the whole. And so we see in Naomi a picture of the old Eve, of the castaway Israel in exile, and we see in Ruth the new Eve, the church, who's going to reunite all nations under Christ, all people being made fellow heirs. So she is given an inheritance in Elimelech, which is from the tribe of Judah. Ruth is. And so in when we read the book of Ruth, we see her ascending, and this is the ascension of the Gentile. This is the ascension of the church as once cast away foreigners, aliens to the commonwealth of Israel, now being made one in a new man, and that church is, of course, his bride. So in Ruth 2:10, she's called a foreigner. In Ruth 2:13, she's called a maidservant. In Ruth 3:9, she's called a maiden. But by 4:13, she's called wife, and that's the word Isa. It's the same word used in Genesis 2:22 to describe Eve. And so Ruth is the picture of the new Eve. Naomi is the picture of the old Eve, that which is being cast out. And all will be reunited and rejoined and receive an inheritance as fellow heirs under the rulership of King David. And so Ruth has this amazing breadth of where it talks about all the way back to Eve, all the way to the new Eve, to the coming of the Christ, and it joins together both Israel and the church in a way that's a beautiful type of thing. So if we read in Isaiah 11, we have Isaiah 11 through 12. So through Israel, all people would come to Christ. This is what it says. So I asked, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, speaking of Israel, salvation has come to all Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, And if their failures means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? And so through Israel, the Gentiles were supposed to be brought into the covenant of God. And this is what it says in 25 through 27. And this is Paul quoting from Isaiah 59 and Isaiah 27. He says this, "Lest you be wise in your own sight," speaking to Gentiles, "I don't want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, he will banish ungodliness from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins." And so there will be a reuniting of Israel and the church, and it will be a reuniting through Christ, who is the son of David, who is the seed of Ruth. And so in a literal sense, Ruth is responsible for aspects of our salvation through the providence of God. And then in a spiritual sense, she's a picture of the new Eve reuniting that castaway Israel who right now is in bitterness, who can't partake of the water until they accept the cross of Jesus Christ, which will sweeten that water. So that's what I wanted to do today. It's just a very short thing. When you read Ruth, think about that. Think about reading it from that perspective, about a casting away from the garden and a re-entering back into the garden through the church. So you read something like Revelation 3, 7 through 9. What does Jesus Christ offer first? He offers access to the tree of life. And the tree of life was in the garden. So that's where we're trying to get back to. Christ being the new Adam, his church being the new Eve. And so there's all sorts of pictures and wonderful things in the book of Ruth. So that's the first video since I'm back. Again, I'm sorry that I've missed so much, and I will be putting out as much as I can in the coming weeks. So God bless, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.